Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to deliver a speech to Congress next week in D.C., joint session, and not everyone, including President Obama, is thrilled about it. Now, some believe the Prime Minister's visit could plunge the historically close relations between the U.S. and Israel to a low point. The president and some congressional Democrats, many in fact, refusing to meet with Netanyahu because he accepted an invitation from the House Speaker John Boehner. Boehner invited Netanyahu to Congress without clearing the speech with the White House.
The president's national security advisor says it's destructive for the Prime Minister of Israel to address the United States Congress next week. I couldn't disagree more. The American people and both parties in Congress have always stood with Israel. Nothing and no one should get in the way of that. But what is destructive, in my view, is making a bad deal that paves the way for a nuclear Iran. That's destructive, and that's why it's so important for the American people to hear what Prime Minister Netanyahu has to say about the grave threats that we're facing.
Now, for his part, the president also has said that he believes Netanyahu's visit is inappropriate, I should say, because it comes just 2 weeks before Israeli elections. And at this point, it is certainly not a given that Netanyahu has popular support back home here for a clear race. Now, let me just ask you, if Boehner came to you and said, Chris, what do you think? Should I invite him, go around the White House in a certain way here? What would you have told him?
Given the circumstance, I would have said his voice needs to be heard. But I would have given the White House a bit of a warning. I wouldn't have just done it on him. And I would have argued profusely that he needs to be there. This president, I think, is delusionary, and I've never said that about any president. But I don't think he has any sense of the threat that's happening in the Middle East. And if Iran gets nuclear weapons, I can't even imagine.
But Congressman, hasn't this president put up more military funding for Israel than any other president?
Yeah, but that's irrelevant, because what really matters is what happens in Iran.
Yeah, but this has nothing to do. Iran is a prop in an Israeli political campaign right now.
Why is it a prop?
Because Bibi's entire visit to the United States right now and his reason for bypassing the president has very little to do with anything other than the fact that he is in probably the political fight of his life right now. Okay. If you look at his advertising in Israel right now, the entire premise of his advertising is that I'm the only one you can feel safe with, and this is part of a this is in essence a campaign stop.
I don't think it's necessarily going to help.
I think he's taken some hits. And in fact, even an Israeli paper released today that AIPAC has even said that you should not be doing this.
But I went to the Middle East, you know, I have to be careful. I don't want to be a newscaster. I went 19 times to Iraq, and on my way I would stop in Israel. And one of the times I met with their top people, they said, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, we're going in.
Okay, here's part of the problem, though. We've seen the cables that Mossad, the intelligence agency in Israel, said that Netanyahu's overhyping how close Iran is to actually capability of a nuclear weapon. So you put that in context with his own political calendar and needs back home and going around a president in a joint session of Congress. You don't have to be a cynic to say you got a lot of motives here going on other than just to have an audience at an important time in Mideast relations, given all of, obviously the volatility.
So you have Iran funding folks in Lebanon, in
Don't
Syria,
get me to defend Iran. I'm not defending Iran,
in Yemen, and now we're going to let them have a nuclear weapon.
I'm not an apologist for Iran, but the point is, a lot of folks, even noted people in State Departments and Republican administrations, don't think engaging them in conversation is a bad idea. It's certainly the status quo is not working.
So let's engage Netanyahu in making an argument before Congress and evaluate his argument.
But at what point do we say, wait a minute, so John Boehner now, as a head of he can't even control his own caucus, and now he's going to directly inject himself into U.S. foreign policy when the Congress has historically allowed the White House to negotiate with one voice.
Can you imagine if Bush was president and a Democrat
invited
and the Speaker of the House did this?
Reiterate what I said on this panel a couple of weeks ago. It never would have gotten to this point if there were a Republican president. This is born born out of a complete frustration and a feeling that the president is tone deaf on this. And I think he has every right to come and make his case before the American people. Sadly, I think history will vindicate him on this. I hope it doesn't get to that
but
point.
His intelligence agency says that he's overhyping. His
doesn't
own
matter.
agency.
But look at what, it doesn't matter what's happening there. It matters what our president is doing. He's just injecting sunset provisions now into the sanctions. Like, these are serious, scary problems. And I think the American people, all you have to do is look at the New York Democrats who have heavy Jewish populations in their district. They're not boycotting this speech. So I think that tells you everything you need to know.
You know, the American politics on this are bad because of the seeming tied at the hip relationship between a lot of Republicans and also a lot of, as you said, members of Congress in our area with heavy Jewish communities to Israel, with sort of no daylight between the two, when there should be daylight between the two when circumstances call for it. You have to be able to criticize your friends and your allies if they're really your friends and your allies. The Israeli politics in all of this are bad too, because as Mike pointed out, Netanyahu to a great degree, I think, is posturing some of the threat for his own political gain. The part of this that mystifies me beyond all belief is that the point of the negotiations, the point of the talks with Iran are to try to reduce their nuclear capabilities and stop them from becoming a nuclear threat. It's reminiscent of what Reagan did with the Soviet Union with Trust But Verify, so that we can actually reduce their threat and prevent them from getting to the point where it does become problematic. And Israel and Iran has been 1 year away from a nuclear weapon for the last 10 or 15 years. So why wouldn't we want to get to the same point we have with Iran, who I would argue would be a much more dangerous nuclear power than we were with the Soviet Union?
Because it has the feeling of a former prime minister who preceded Churchill. You know, we'll let them take Czechoslovakia and then they'll stop. It has this terrible feeling to me, just like 39.
What are we letting them have, except for
what we're letting them have is we are letting them have their resources again. We're letting them ultimately have a weapon. We're letting them continue. They're not stopping and destroying. They still have everything in place.
And we would have an oversight, or at least the capacity to see what they're doing. And if they that's part of the negotiation. And if they violate that term, then we can go to sanctions, we can go to other mechanisms as well.
Put a sunset provision on the sanctions. Like, that's crazy. Oh, just hold out for a few years and then you can go back to doing what you're doing. It's a ridiculous policy.
There's also the argument, Richard, that it's totally disrespectful of Netanyahu, what he's trying to do, disrespecting this president. They're doing an end, and I wonder why. I'm just throwing it out there. They're doing an end around with this president.
I agree with that. It is
and it's not right. It's not right.
The argument for not doing it is then when Democrats are in charge, they could do the same thing. And there are certain things you just both sides agree not to do.
He's going to have a meeting with both Reid and McConnell separately, so it's not that he's not going to get an audience with Congress. There is form and substance to us, and I do think the form is important.
And the Prime Minister of Israel has an open line of communication with most members of Congress. Right. The last thing I would add about this entire thing is, okay, so have the speech, postpone it until after your election, baby.
And I think the calendar has a lot to do with this. All right, just in case there's no semblance of unanimity here, we're going to take a look at the always interesting issue when it comes to abortion. Fascinating case coming out of Indiana. Should the government tell doctors when they can and can't perform them? Well, a Senate panel in Indiana thinks they should, and there are interesting conditions on that. We'll talk about that after we come back from break.